Hey everyone, this is Jay from Boulder Creek Railroad, and I have a very interesting video series for you today. This is going to be a series on remotoring, adding DCC sound and lighting, as well as painting brass locomotives. So the reason why I'm making this video series is because I feel like for a lot of people, doing this can seem quite daunting. Brass locomotives are very pretty engines. There's a lot of tiny little minute details. They're worth a lot of money, and they are a little complicated when it comes to electrical and painting. It's a very interesting way of making locomotives and prepping them to make them look like the plastic models that we use today can be a little scary. So we're going to go over the process of doing all of this over the course of the next couple of videos. In today's video, we're going to be talking about painting in particular. I have two locomotives, a brass K36 and a K28 from Balboa and PFM, respectively. And these locomotives are bare brass. I just picked them up, and they need a little bit of work. First off, of course, they need some paint. There's some, you can see there's some tarnishing here on the brass itself. The motors are really old open frame motors that need to be replaced, and of course I want to add lighting and DCC sound to them. So to start today, we're just going to kind of go over working on painting this locomotive. Now, before we begin, we need to understand how brass locomotives are made. Of course, they are made out of brass, and that brass is silver soldered together, and then there is a coat of lacquer, clear lacquer, that is placed over the top of the locomotive. That lacquer is used as a protective coat against the tarnishing of the brass. It also acts as a primer coat so that you can paint the locomotives. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these locomotives that we purchase today that are brass are quite old, and that lacquer layer is starting to fail. You can see it on this locomotive where you're starting to see tarnishing around certain components on the top of the boiler here and on the inside of this tender. And so that becomes a problem because that lacquer coat is failing and it will peel off. So if we paint over this model, eventually that paint will come off and it will leave the bare brass exposed, and that will then tarnish in the air. So for the majority of brass locomotives, you now need to go back and remove this layer and then prep it for paint with a primer layer. And so it's a little more complicated now. Now, I understand this may seem a little bit daunting, but trust me, it's honestly not as complicated as it seems. There's a number of ways to remove this lacquer coat from the locomotive. Now, the number one way that people do this is they use paint like the remover or paint thinner, and they dip the model in that to remove it. The other way that people use it, and the way I will be showing in my videos, is using an air eraser, which is essentially just a mini sandblaster that connects up to your air compressor for an airbrush. This method has the added benefit of also adding a little bit of crazing to the brass. And this is actually a good thing because it creates a situation in which the primer can actually adhere to the actual brass. Because if I was just to take a thing of primer and spray the locomotive as is onto the brass, it wouldn't adhere to the brass very well. So the air eraser will add in that toothing necessary for that primer to adhere. Now, any of these methods will work. There's tons of resources on how to use paint thinners or different sorts of chemicals to remove the tarnish from the locomotive. But I'm just going to show this method because it's going to be really useful, and it does two things in once. It tooths up the brass and also removes the lacquer layer. So now that we have that out of the way, let's go over some of the tools that we are going to need. Starting off, we need a method to take apart our brass locomotive. So I have some of these precision screwdrivers here, which I will use to take apart the locomotive. After we take it apart, we're going to need to remove all that lacquer. And of course, I have this here, which is a air eraser. This is from Master, and this is really cheap. I picked this up for about 30 bucks, I think, on eBay. And you just basically, you put in some grit into this big thing here, and then it will spray it out over the model. As for grit, you could use standard air eraser grit. However, I find that might be just a little bit too strong. So I actually use baking soda. It's actually a lot quicker to use and cheaper and easier to acquire as well. You just got to make sure that you are in a non-humid environment, as this will then clump together and clog up your air eraser, permanently disabling it. So you do not want to be in a humid environment. I have a moisture trap built into my compressor, as well as one built into the line that goes to my airbrush, to my air eraser. And that definitely helps quite a bit, so that I don't get any water into the baking soda as I erase from the model. After you do that, you need to clean your model. Now, you can use a toothbrush or just any sort of brush with some soapy water, and at that point, you need to be wearing gloves. You do not want to touch the bare brass after you've removed the lacquer coat. The oil will make it difficult for you to prime the model, and it will tarnish the brass quicker. So, you can use that, or I also have an ultrasonic cleaner, which I'll be using, but you can use a toothbrush and some soapy water to clean off the model. Then you will need an airbrush. I have this one here. This is my old airbrush. This is my tried and true friend. I've been using this for a long time, and this is what I'll be using to prime and paint the model. Now you can also use spray paint. You can. I personally am not a big fan of doing that because I feel like it adds a too thick of a layer to the brass locomotive, but you can. Under no circumstance should you be using brushes to paint brass locomotives. It just simply does not work. You need to be using some sort of way of using air to apply it to the model. So with all of that out of the way, let's start to disassemble our model. I'm starting here with the tender. Now it is very important that you take your time and you are very careful during this process. Brass models have a lot of very tiny screws and very tiny springs built into them. And that creates a problem because if you lose any of these components, finding replacements can be quite difficult. Northwest Shortline in particular has pretty much all the parts you need, but finding the exact screw or spring will take a lot of time and research. So just be very careful during this process. Now to start with the tender here, the only thing I really need to remove from the locomotive is these trucks. We're going to start just by removing this and the spring that is connected to them, and I'll put them away over here. I will not be sandblasting the wheels or these trucks in particular, only the shell for the tender. Now is also a good time to measure the interior of your tender. This will give you an idea of exactly how big of a speaker or how much room you have to place any components into your model. Now I also went in and added in my speaker holes. You can see them right here in the center. I added in a whole bunch there, so that way my sound could make it out of here. I also added in a big hole right here and one located right here, so that way my wiring can end up underneath the tender. And that'll be hidden with some coal that I'll put right there, so that way you don't end up seeing those wires. The next step is to disassemble the locomotive. There are two major parts of brass locomotives. The brass superstructure, which is just the shell of the locomotive, not the running gear or the frame, just the shell, which is entirely made out of brass. And then there, of course, is the frame. And the frame contains all the running gear, wheels, wiring, motor, and other components to make the engine work. Now, the reason why we have to disassemble these from each other is because the frame, including all these wheels here, have plastic and rubber components. This cannot go into an air eraser or into lacquer thinner or into any sort of chemical or into a ultrasonic cleaner because that'll destroy the old rubber and plastic and insulation for the wheels, rendering the engine unusable. So you do not, under any circumstances, want to disassemble or put any of this into that. So you need to just get this guy, the big shell, off the engine. There are 3 screws on most brass engines that hold this on. There is one located up here near the cylinders here. It's right there in the center. And then there are 2 here located on the back, right there, and you need to remove those. With those 3 screws off, we can now lift the shell off the engine here, just like that. And you just got to be kind of careful that you don't get anything caught. And there you go. So there's your brass superstructure, and here's the frame of the engine. So now would also be a good time to go ahead and drill any holes for your headlight in the front here. So I'm just going to take one, drill one there, and drill one through there as well. So with all that now drilled out, this engine is ready to be masked. So we can go ahead and take a look here at our chassis here. And there's a couple things that we need to take note of. First off, you can disassemble the whole entirety of this assembly here. All these wheels, there's springs on each driver. There's a ton of screws, a lot of complicated components. I do not suggest that you do this. It's better if you just paint over the tarnished wheels here, just clean it with some soapy water by hand, and then paint over it after it dries. It's much better to do that than it is to disassemble all these components. Now you can sandblast all these high touch areas like these cylinder heads here, the rear frame, stuff like that. You can do that, but you have to make sure that you mask off all these components here that would normally not want to be touched by those sorts of things. But I'm just gonna sand it off, clean it off with some soapy water and then spray this by hand. But now that we have this ready to go and our tender ready to go, we can actually prep for air erasing. So I have my air eraser here and I have my baking soda, and we're just gonna go ahead and fill up this hopper here at the top with some baking soda. Now before we begin air erasing, there's a couple things you need to know. You need to be doing this outside because the particulates from the gun will actually get everywhere. You need to make sure that you're wearing gloves. You do not want to be touching your model at any point in time after you remove the lacquer coat, so make sure you're wearing some sort of protective gloves, and wear a respirator and eye protection. That way you don't get any of the particulate into your lungs or into your eyes. Now that we got all that out of the way, let's go ahead and begin air erasing.
So after sandblasting, your model should look very dull. You can see that it's much duller color compared to the chassis of the model there. And that lets you know that you've removed all the lacquer coat and that you've also crazed the metal, which is a good thing. So there you go. Now it's time to go ahead and put this in the ultrasonic cleaner and get this guy all ready to go.
So after airbrushing it, we're going to put it in here in the ultrasonic cleaner. I'm going to set it for about 30 minutes and then set it to a little bit of a warmer temp, just enough so that's a little warm water, not hot water, but just warm. And then we'll let it go, and then we'll be ready to dry it and prime the paint. So while my other parts are in the ultrasonic cleaner, I'm gonna go ahead and clean off this part here. I've already masked off a couple sections here. This is the motor mount, so I need a clean surface without paint for that. That way I can glue my motor to there. I covered up the center gear here on the drivers as well as the tip of this wire here, so that way I don't get paint on those components. But what I'm going to do right now is take a toothbrush and some soapy water, and I'm just going to clean off the model. The whole purpose of this is just to get all that oil and grime off of these components, so that way when I paint, there's not going to be any sort of stuff on here. Do it nice and do a good job cleaning this, and just be careful that you don't end up with any sort of breaking any parts on here or messing anything up, so just be careful. So with those parts drying, I can actually go to the parts here out of the ultrasonic cleaner, which are now dry and ready to go. I'm just using some surface primer here. This is some Vallejo stuff. I'm just going to put it in my airbrush, and we're going to go ahead and prime all these components. Make sure you do very light coats of primer. You just want to make sure that it tooths into the brass really nicely. Doing those light layers, make sure everything has time to dry. That way, when you do your actual paint, it has a great surface to adhere to. So now all the model parts are primed. So we're gonna let this sit for an entire day just so it can have time to fully dry. And then we'll come back tomorrow with the airbrush and we'll do our first layer of grimy black, which is just gonna make the entire model black. For the basic black color of the locomotive, I'm going to be using True Color Paints Grimy Black. Come these nice airbrush paints, they're really nice. And it gives it kind of like a dirty black appearance, not really like a nice clean locomotive, which I find is really good for engines like this. So with that, our grimy black is now all dry, so it's time to begin masking off the front of our boiler and smoke box, so that way we can go ahead and paint graphite coloring to the front of the locomotive. So we now have the graphite color on our smoke box and on our firebox down there, which means now we can go on to detail painting. Make sure you have a bunch of references for what your locomotive is. This is a K36, and I'm going to be doing locomotive number 480, which currently resides at the Durango and Silverton Railroad. And so I have a whole bunch of reference images on my phone I'll be looking at when doing all this detail painting, and then we're going to go ahead and weather the engine. So I've gone ahead and done my detail painting, as well as added my gloss coat. The gloss coat is for the decals, that way they stick to the surface and adhere better. And then we'll end up painting the top of this model with a flat coat once the decals have set. So I've started decaling the model. I'm using K4 decals. You can pick up these decals off of eBay. I'm not going to get too much into exactly how to do decals. There's tons of different resources on how to do it. I am using Microsol and Microset, but you can look up exactly how to do this or use your own method and make your own decals, whatever works for you. With everything now decaled and our painting finished, it's time to give the model a flat coat to seal the decals in and finish the painting on the model. So with that, our locomotive has now been decaled, painted, and weathered. So I hope this was a useful video, helpful so that you guys can figure out how to paint brass and show you that it's not really that difficult of a process. I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll be doing the decoder installation in part 2, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching and happy railroading.